Hi, my name is Jordan Wagstaff and I'm going to show you my assessment material for ACM Music Production and Sound Engineering. I used FL Studio's and Machine 2.0 to create these 3 tracks. So this song is called My Mind. I created this using FL Studios. The production technique that I used was sampling, in which I used Slice X, and the song that I sampled was called Japanese Music. The song was called Snow. I chopped it up to create the intro, and once the intro was created I started to play around with the same cuts to create the melody. Once the melody was created, I added it to the mixer and then started adding some effects to it. I added Fruity Delay 2, Stereo Enhancer and Parametric EQ 2. Now, Delay 2 was used for the purpose to widen the sound of the actual sample so it sounded a little bit more clearer. The Stereo Enhancer was to make the sound thicker and bigger so that it just sounded a little bit more broader and it filled the speakers up a little bit more. And then I used Parametric EQ 2 to get rid of any unwanted noise. There was quite like a white noise sound I wasn't really keen on, so I got rid of that. Now, after that I kind of realised that once I got the melody I needed to add a bass line. The only problem is that when you're sampling you need to find the key that the sample is in, so you're able to create a bass line from that. So I created the bass line, and once the bass line was created, again I added it to the mixer and I played around with the faders to mix it a little bit through the process. I then went into my search browser, which my search browser is where I find my drum kits, my snares, my hi-hats, anything that I want to use for drums and so on and so forth. I'd created a few of my own drum kits, so I grabbed them and I put them in, and I also added a couple of crashes and rides. I double up on my hi-hats, my crashes and my rides so that I can pound them later on in the process of the mix. I made a simple groove to the beat, a simple groove to the song that would fit the melody and the bass line for it, and I felt that this was appropriate. Once this is done, I'd made roughly about quarter of the song. I structured quarter of the song, and at this point I kind of thought to myself, well, it sounds good, however I need to add something to it because it sounds a little bit bland. So I thought, what's going to go well with a flute sounding sample? What's going to go well with a nice bass line and some kick drums? I thought, strings. Strings is what I thought would be the next appropriate move. So I used a couple plugins. I used Nexus to get some quite hard hitting strings that were very loud in volume but also very, very big and wide sounding, but without making it overpower the sample. Again, I had to find the key, because if I didn't find the right key, again it would go off key and you could have numerous of problems. Once this was done, I made it a simple build up melody, and then I also got another type of strings that were staccato strings, and at this point I added them to the intro as well as in and out of the song, which is actually that there. As you can see, I put it in my piano roll. All of the instruments were then later added up to the mixer, and what I did was started to play around with the faders to kind of get the right mix. I first started off with melodies such as the sample, the strings and the bass line. What I did there was I started to play around with the faders to get the kind of right mix, the bass too high, the bass too low, the strings too high, the strings too low, depending on kind of the volume I want them and the impact to have. And then what I did was, once I'd found the right mix I felt was appropriate, what I did was then created another channel saying melodies and put them all into that channel 1 so that I could change the volume up and down without affecting the mix. I didn't really want to affect the mix of the melodies I'd already mixed down. Then the next move was the drum kit. So I'd created the own of my kicks, my snares, my hi-hats. Like I said earlier, I doubled up on my hi-hats, crashes and rides because I like to pan my hi-hats, crashes and rides cymbals to kind of give it more of a realistic drum sound, but not only to do that, but also to make it sound a lot bigger in sound, so it was a lot wider. Once I'd kind of played around with the faders again to kind of get the right mix, hi-hats being too loud or too low, the crashes being too loud, so on and so forth. Again, I added it to a separate channel mixer, all of the instruments, and so I could change the volume and so on. At this point, obviously I had the two channels, which is melodies and drums. I felt that the melodies were fine, so I didn't add any kind of extra effects into that because I didn't feel that it was appropriate. I didn't think it was needed. I think altogether it sounded fine. The next move was the drums. Now, the drums sounded good, however, to kind of make them more realistic, I decided to add some reverb. I used Fruity Reverb 2, and what I did was I used this to create a small dynamic room of reverb that would make it sound more realistic and that it had almost been recorded in. And I just felt that was appropriate. The process after that was really just trying to get the best master out of it, and in my opinion I used something called Maximus. On Maximus you're able to change the bandwidth, you're able to change the frequencies, you're able to change different things like that, the levels of the low frequencies, the level of the high frequencies and the level of the mid frequencies, and then I mastered it down. This is Soulful Life, and the production technique I used was actually using the presets that you have within FL. I didn't use any of the plugins that I brought personally, just the plugins that you got built in with FL, and did some slight alterations to the plugins that I used. When I first created this piece, I actually started off with a drum kit because I felt that sometimes when you can't make a melody off the scratch of your head, sometimes getting a nice groovy drum kit and adding a bit of swing to it kind of gets you going and think some melodies. You can then start playing with melodies over the top of the drum kit. I used several different kicks, several different snares, and layered them up. I used two hi-hats exactly the same and panned them left and right, not equally the same amount, but I don't know, 37% on one and 42% on the other, just to kind of widen the sound up and making it sound more realistic. And I also added an open hi-hat to it, but I didn't layer that one up. I didn't feel that it was necessary. Once I'd made the drum kit, I felt that I needed to make a melody, so the melody I first started off was the keys, the piano, and the progression key progression I actually got was now, I thought that sounded rather nice. However, the first time I listened to it, I thought that sounds really nice, but I didn't really know where to go from it, and I thought, well, I've got chords there, I need to add an overlaying melody in which I use keys again. I used FL keys, which is again a piano, and the melody I created from that was this. And I started to make way in what I wanted to do. Now, even though the chords were done, I thought there needs to be something else added to it that's going to make it sound a little bit more emotional, because I felt that the piece was rather emotional. And what I did was I added some strings, solo strings, and I just followed the underlined chord progression to create it, which was, let me turn that up a second. So that was the melody that I made with the solo strings. And then from there, obviously I created the melody and I created the kit and the groove that I wanted for the kit to do. So I added a bass line, again that was followed the same as the solo strings to give it a bit more oomph behind it, which was now that was quite a deep bass, and I didn't really think that it was enough. So I added in another bass to it, again following the same as the previous bass and the solo strings, and this is what I got. They're quite deep sounding again, but it kind of had a few more higher frequencies in it because it sounded like it being sampled from an actual bass, whereas the other one was a synthetic bass. After this, I added a choir, and I didn't really as such follow the melody that I'd made or the chord progression. I found some kind of melody that I liked that went over the top. There's like a rule of 3 where you can only have 3 different melodies in a song before it can start causing problems. And then most songs that we have in today's generation either contain 2 to 3 alternative melodies in one song. So I added this. And then I actually found like a really weird kind of acoustic guitar sound, and it sounded rather weird, but I liked it, and it kind of made things a little bit more funky, I thought. So I added this to it, and this again followed the chord progression. So I added that, and then I started to structure the song and develop the song into how I wanted. So to begin with the song, I started off with it slowly coming in. And it slowly builds up, as you'll hear in the song. Once this is all done, I add all my drums into my channel, into my mixer, and into individual channels, and I did the same for my melodies. I started to then play around with the faders, to making sure the kicks weren't too loud over the snares weren't too loud over the kicks, and the hi-hat was at the right level that I felt that was appropriate. And then I panned the hi-hats left and right, the 2 close hi-hats that were the same left and right, and then change the volume of the open hi-hat as well. Then I started to play around with the actual instruments. Now I wanted the chords to sound a little bit hard hitting, so I added a parametric EQ and got rid of the lower frequencies that weren't needed. I didn't feel that was necessary, and cut off the high frequencies that I felt that weren't needed as well. For FL keys 2, this was for the main melody that kind of carried the song. I added parametric EQ 2 again to get rid of all the low frequencies and just make the high frequencies sound a little bit clearer. And then I also use reverb 2. Again, you can choose the kind of the size of the room you want, and depending on the size of the room, the more reverb you get. I wanted a slight amount of reverb on there, not too much, but enough so it was obvious, but not that it was reverb coming out your ears. Now, the next thing was I added obviously the solo strings. I didn't add any effects to that. I didn't feel that it was necessary, and for the bass lines I didn't think it was necessary. I've done the tweaking within the actual plugin itself, so I didn't really feel that it was necessary. I added a little bit of reverb to the choir because I felt that when it wasn't on, it didn't sound as good as it did with reverb being on, and it just kind of made things sound a little bit more flowing. It made it flow a little bit better than it did when it didn't have any reverb. It also fitted in the mix a little bit better as well, and I didn't add any effects to the weird acoustic guitar sound that I'd found in my direct wave. Once this was done, I went and changed the faders and got the kind of volume of what I wanted. So I wanted the chords to be quite high and the piano and the melody to be high enough but not so high that it overpowers everything. I wanted the bass to be able to be heard, but more so to kind of give the chord progression a little bit more power behind it, and the strings were there to kind of make things more emotional. That weaves in and out of the song to kind of make it emotional parts, and then it leans away from it. And then I wanted the choir to be heard, but I wanted it to kind of sit in the mix. I didn't want it to sit over the mix. I wanted to sit in comfortably, and that it fitted around everything, and it just fitted nicely. That's what I wanted to make sure it did, and it did. And then the weird acoustic guitar thing I found on the direct wave player, I again needed to be approximately about the same level as the chords, because that was quite a key feature of the song. Once this was done, I again used Maximus. I again feel this is more of an appropriate way for me to master, and I got rid of the frequencies I didn't want, and I did want the low frequencies, the high frequencies, changed the levels of them, the high frequencies, low frequencies, mid frequencies, and then exported it out. The next piece I used a piece of software called 2.0, Machine 2.0, and I used a piece of hardware which is the Machine Micro. And I wanted to go for an alternative piece of music completely, in which I decided to do like a modern piece of classical. The piece is called Modern Classical for that reason. And what I used several different instruments. The instruments that I used were session pizzicato. I can't pronounce the word, I'm sorry. I used session staccato strings, I used session sustained strings, I used session tremolo strings, again I can't pronounce that too well, and I used the piano as well. I created something similar to this at college, and at college I had the software to be able to use Contact 5 in, which had a double bass in, and unfortunately using Machine and even on FL I don't have a double bass, so what I did was I actually used a piano for the double bass to give it a little bit more oomph, but it wasn't too loud that you could completely hear the piano over everything, and the chords are quite low down anyway, so that it kind of gave that effect. I felt that if I used an actual bass, that it would throw the piece of the classical off, because in classical pieces there are also pianos used. I first started off with a simple melody with the, I can't pronounce the strings called again, the pizzicato, and started off with a simple kind of melody, and I also made a chord progression with the staccato strings. They sounded good. I also made a sustained string progression, and what I did was with the first two strings, such as the pizzicato and the staccato strings, what I did was I let them go on for like the first kind of first bit of the song, and then all the instruments slowly start coming in. So the sustained strings came in, and then the tremolo strings came in, and then the piano came in. What I did then from there was I slowly made the song build up and up and up and up until it got ridiculously fast, and then just cuts out, and then everything slows down twice as slow than it did when it first started out, and then it builds up again to the same speed it was originally, and then it comes out. That's how I made it. I used it using the software and the piece of hardware as well. It's a modern classical piece, so I didn't feel that I needed to add any drums, I didn't need to add anything of the sorts. I just kind of knew what needed to be in classical. I knew what I felt was needed. I knew that the main melody never really cuts out, and I knew that sustained strings were always in classical. There's always a sustained string in there, and there's some sort of progression in it, and I knew that there was a build up and a cut out. From there I went into my mixer within Machine 2.0, and what I did was I came in here and we have the sample. Now I didn't actually add any, on the master of that particular piece I added, there you go. I actually added some reverb to it, because a lot of classical music's played in halls or on stage and areas like that. You do tend to get quite a bit of reverb. I didn't want to add too much reverb, but it needed to be somewhat noticeable so that it's kind of almost sounded like it was being played within an area you would get a lot of kind of reverb from. So I added reverb to the pizzicato strings. I added reverb to the session staccato strings, and that was all I did. I only added some strings, some reverb to the first two strings. The actual piano itself kind of had like a reverb. It actually had reverb in it, so I didn't need to add any reverb or change it, because I felt the amount of reverb given to it anyway sounded nice. And I felt that if I added some reverb to the I don't know what they call it again, sorry, the tremolo strings, it would just sound really bizarre. Once this was done, I needed to kind of make sure that everything was at the correct kind of level, because you know everything needs to be clear, but everything also needed to make sure that you know you didn't have something too loud and overwhelming that it got rid of the main melody, or it got rid of the sustained strings. It all needed to fit nicely, and so I changed the levels of each individual strings that I used, and from there I exported the song out. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.